Welcome. Thanks for coming today. This is a talk in the series sponsored by our Maxwell alum Carol Becker, a series on the Middle East that Carol has underwritten now for a couple of years, and we're very pleased that Carol's continuing support of our program, and she was especially excited to learn about today's event. I had a note from her this morning. It's a real pleasure for us to welcome to campus and to the Maxwell School Tamara Cofman Wittes, who's Senior Fellow and Director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Wittes was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from November 2009 through January of 2012, where she coordinated U.S. policy on democracy and human rights in the Middle East for the State Department. She worked with someone else that we all know here at Maxwell. Our Dean, Jim Steinberg, and Dr. Wittes were close colleagues at State. She also oversaw the Middle East Partnership Initiative and served as Deputy Special Coordinator for Middle East Transition. She was central to organizing the United States government's response to the Arab awakening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tamara Cofman Wittes.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Is this working? I hope. Thank you so much, Bill, for the invitation and for the chance to be with all of you today. And it's a special treat to see friends and colleagues from different parts of my career, both in academia and in the policy world. So thanks for the welcome. I want to start by telling you a little story and taking you back to a particular date more than 2 years ago, January 14th, 2011. I was that day flying back from Doha, Qatar, to Washington after organizing a visit to Doha by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I was, as Bill mentioned, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. I'd been the State Department's point person for a conference, a multinational conference called the Forum for the Future. It was a summit that's held every year between the G8 governments and Middle Eastern governments to talk about political and economic reform. And it had just concluded in Doha. Secretary Clinton gave the keynote speech at the forum on January 13th. She talked about unemployment among young people. She talked about corruption, about depleted natural resources. And she said, in too many places, in too many ways, the region's foundations are sinking into the sand. Now, the assembled Arab foreign ministers at the Forum for the Future were surprised by the fierce urgency in her tone in that speech. But they all knew, of course, what she was talking about, because for 3 weeks already, by that point, protesters had been marching in the streets of Tunisia, calling for their dictator to leave. Now, to those of us in Middle East studies and political science, Tunisia had always seemed like a fairly stable, successful police state. Repressive but peaceful, an economic growth rate of about 9% in the years running up to the revolution, close trade and tourism ties to Europe. And yet, the very next day after Secretary Clinton spoke those words at the forum, the Tunisian army refused to put down these massive protests, and Tunisia's dictator fled the country. Now, the trends that Secretary Clinton was talking about on that January day 2.5 years ago in Doha, the trends that produced what we now call the Arab awakening or the Arab uprisings or the Arab Spring, these were not new phenomena. They had been quietly building across the Arab world over a decade or more. And since Ben Ali fled Tunisia, of course, we've seen revolution in Egypt, revolution in Libya, a negotiated transition in Yemen. We've also seen popular protests in Bahrain crushed by government forces backed by Saudi Arabia. We've seen what began as a peaceful uprising in Syria transformed by Bashar Assad's brutality into a bloody civil war. So the hopeful images of peaceful people power uprisings in the Arab world from a couple of years ago suggested a certain upward trajectory and the potential for the United States to play a different, a more positive, a more proactive role in the region in the coming years. But when we look at the newspapers today, the Middle East looks more unstable and troubling than ever. So I think we can all be forgiven if we arrive here in the middle of October with a real sense of whiplash about America's policy toward the Middle East. If you were to have taken a snapshot even 6 or 8 months ago, you would have said, well, this is a picture of America pivoting away from the Middle East, pivoting toward Asia, right? A withdrawal, a desire to disengage. He feels he was elected in part to dismantle, an approach that was perceived by many here and by many in the region as emphasizing the military tool over much, an approach that many viewed as too unilateral, and as former National Security Advisor Tom Donilon put it in a speech last spring to the Asia Society, a region in which the United States was relatively overinvested as compared to other parts of the world where it was underinvested. And yet events in this region seem, in a sense, to drag the administration back in almost against its will. I think there are 3 reasons why this has happened, why an administration that has been consistently determined to shift its approach in the Middle East and to step at least somewhat away from a heavy focus on this region, nonetheless finds itself in a position where its strong leadership, including perhaps the use of military force, is being demanded by regional actors. Well, the first reason is fairly obvious. It's that the region itself is undergoing a political earthquake. The Arab world today is experiencing the greatest upheaval that it's seen in at least a half a century. And the Arab revolutions, the uprisings, the outpouring of public demands for change, the breakdown of what looked like strong autocratic states, these are the manifestations of deep underlying changes in Arab society, in Arab economics, in Arab politics that, as I said, have been building for a long time. Now, I wrote about these changes in my 2008 book, Freedom's Unsteady March. This massive rising generation of young Arabs who are healthier and better educated than any generation of Arabs before them, they see a vast gap between their aspirations for themselves as individuals and for their communities and the realities that are all around them. The stagnation and inequality and corruption of state-driven clientelist economies widens this gap and leaves them with little hope. And changes in media and in technology allow young Arabs in places like Egypt and Morocco to see much more clearly how their own societies compare with dynamic societies elsewhere, places like India or Indonesia or Brazil, that Egyptians were taught in school are their peers. India and Indonesia, the co-founders with Egypt of the non-aligned movement under Nasser, have surged ahead while Egypt has remained stuck. And these technologies have also helped young Arabs forge a common sense of purpose, a common identity, and to spread amongst themselves ideas of what they want to change and how. So these then are the roots of the revolutions. The technology, the economic changes, the demographic changes. These are the roots of the revolutions that began in December 2010. And those forces are still there, powerful and deep, all across the Arab world, in rich states and poor, in homogenous states and states that have a lot of social diversity. The region is changing. And stability won't return to this region until governments and the private sector change in response, until they make room for innovation, until they make room for real participation, until they treat citizens as citizens with equality and dignity, and so begin to close that gap between expectations and reality. So it's certainly the case that events on the ground in the Middle East have prevented a situation where the United States could say, this region's relatively stable, there's a defined order, looks like it'll be sustainable, so we can turn our relative attention elsewhere. In fact, the region's undergoing a tectonic shift, and this presents a challenge for the United States, as it does for every actor in and around this region. For half a century, the United States has essentially been a defender of the regional status quo, the existing balance of power, the existing dominance of certain actors, and now there's no status quo to defend. So there's a basic strategic reorientation that will have to take place. But at a moment when the trajectory of the region itself is so unclear, it's hard for the United States to figure out what that strategic reorientation should look like. Now, the United States doesn't have decisive influence over the political trajectory of these Arab states undergoing change, but it does have a huge stake in the outcome. And so the administration has to figure out what it needs from this region and what it can't afford to get from this region. And it needs to develop long-term policies to deal with those things. Now, I would say that the intense focus that we've seen from the Obama administration on diplomacy to remove the threat of Iran's nuclear program is a very good example of such long-term, consistent strategic focus. The administration knows that one thing it can't afford in the Middle East is a nuclear Iran, inspiring proliferation among other regional actors, and creating an environment rife with risks of overreach, miscalculation, and conflict. And the administration has been consistent, patient, creative in its approach to that issue. With the election of Rouhani, there seems to be a real change in Tehran and a real opportunity. And the administration is working to test that opportunity and to try and maintain the political space here at home to do that. It's impressive. But there's a second factor that's complicated America's approach to the region in the last couple of years, and that I believe will make it very hard for the United States to disengage, relatively speaking, from the Middle East, and that is America's relationships with key actors in the region, precisely because the region has been so thoroughly upended, because there's no status quo left to defend. It used to be that the United States and its major regional partners were very much on the same page, supporting the same agenda. Today, I think there are some pretty fundamental differences between the United States and key regional actors on questions like what caused this earthquake in our politics? What are the roots of instability in the region? What are the primary threats? What is necessary to return the regional order to stability? There are disagreements between the United States and Saudi Arabia on those questions, abundantly revealed over the last week or so. There are differences between the United States and Israel on some of these questions. And, you know, we've seen these emerge before in Bahrain, in Egypt, and now, of course, over Syria. So there really are some underlying differences and perhaps some divergent interests between the United States and key regional partners. I'm not worried about a full-blown rupture in U.S.-Saudi ties, by the way. I don't think that what we've seen in the Saudi Declaration of Independence is necessarily that unprecedented. But it's not just melodrama. These are differences that can't be papered over. And until these disagreements are resolved, until the trajectory of the region becomes clearer, not only will you see continued demands from regional actors for greater American engagement, but what you will see, I think, is quite a lot of lobbying, a lot of advocacy toward the White House from different actors who don't necessarily agree amongst themselves, pulling the United States in different directions in the Middle East. Now, there's a third reason, I think, why the United States has real difficulty pivoting away from the Middle East. And it's a reason that is entirely made in America. And it's one that I think we need to talk about more as a society. The American public is tired. It's impatient. It's inward-looking. The wars of the last decade cost us in ways that we are still coming to grips with. Our economy is still hurting. Our governmental resources are constrained. And our politics are not working very well. If you look at the regular poll that the Chicago Council on Global Affairs does, for example, on Americans' views of foreign policy, they have a question that they've asked for years. Do you believe that it is best for the country to take an active part in world affairs or to stay out of world affairs? Now, how many Americans do you think last year said that the United States is best off if it stays out of world affairs? Anyone want to guess? 75. Well, it wasn't quite that dire, but it was a historic high. It's 38% of Americans say that it's best for the country to stay out of world affairs. 38%. That is the highest number that we've seen answering that question that way since 1992. In other words, since right after the Cold War and the exhaustion that followed that episode. Now, I'm a foreign policy professional, okay? So obviously I believe that it matters for the United States if we play an active part in world affairs. I believe most Americans can be persuaded to support that active role. But for those of us who hold that view, last month was a real moment of truth. President Obama decided to take the question of a limited military strike on Syria to Congress. Now, we all saw the swift, fierce, massive outpouring of public opposition to even a very limited, what Secretary Kerry called an unbelievably small strike on Syria. I was talking to one member of the House a couple weeks ago about this, somebody who cares a lot about foreign affairs and whose district generally cares a lot about foreign affairs. And this member told me they got thousands of calls on the question of an authorization to use military force in Syria. How many in favor? 2. 2 out of thousands. So President Obama found himself at the end of the summer with a Middle Eastern crisis that wouldn't allow for any orderly U.S. disengagement, allies in the region deeply anxious about the idea of American abandonment, and demanding in all kinds of sometimes obstreperous ways greater American involvement, and an American public that was shouting loudly, "No way, no way." So it's notable to me that in the face of all these countervailing pressures, where President Obama has chosen to place his bets. Let's take a look at the speech he gave at the UN General Assembly in September. He set aside, he didn't repudiate, but I would say he very clearly set aside the rhetoric that he enunciated in May 2011, in the midst of the Arab Spring. The approach to the region he took in that speech was rooted in the premise that the Arab revolutions were driven by bottom-up demands for more transparent, accountable, responsive government. That the region had become unstable because leaders were not responding to those demands, and that stability required more democratic government. All of those ideas that he enunciated in May 2011 were essentially absent from his UNGA speech. I think what we saw instead was a focus on nearer-term goals, the protection of narrower security interests when it comes to Egypt, and advancing diplomatic solutions to these major challenges with Syria, Iran, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. But it's interesting to me what the president achieved in making that speech. He took a moment of intense demand from the region for a larger American role, demand and ambivalence, let's be very clear, but demand nonetheless, and he seemed to be sending 3 messages to, I think, 3 different audiences. First, to the American public, he was saying, sub rosa, I hear you. I'm not opposing you. I understand your mood. I understand our constraints. But that doesn't mean that we can do nothing. We shouldn't do nothing. If we do nothing, there are even worse consequences, and we can't afford that. Second, I think there was a message addressed to the world at large saying, I haven't changed. I'm still the guy who gave the Nobel acceptance speech in December 2009. I still have a preference for non-military tools. I still have a preference for multilateral approaches. And the third message, I think, was to key international partners and also to rising powers and key players like Russia and China, setting expectations, saying essentially, if you want me to maintain these preferences, if you want me to restrain the aspects of America's engagement in the world that you say you found so troubling over the last decade, then you have to step up and help too. This is not going to be a unilateral process. We need some burden sharing, the effort demands that we all pitch in. So I read those as the three core messages in that policy speech at the UN General Assembly, which Susan Rice tells us was a deliberate, calculated, thoughtful recalibration of America's approach to the Middle East. Now, there are two big questions, I think, hanging out there in the wake of that policy pronouncement. The first is, what about stability? What about all the things you said about the relationship between stability and democracy? Does the president still believe that the Arab world won't stabilize until governments respond to popular demands for change? If so, given America's keen interest in regional stability, what are we going to do about it? Maybe we can't force it, but does that mean we don't do anything at all? Does that mean we have no influence at all? And the second big question I think this speech begs is about these three high-stakes diplomatic gambits on Israel, Syria, and Iran. What happens if they fail? Well, with Iran, we know the answer. It's been repeatedly articulated, and it's a military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, either by the Israelis because they lose faith in American management of the negotiating process, or by the United States because Washington concludes that the negotiations are a failure. On Syria, the demands for military engagement that were staved off by this US-Russian compact over chemical weapons have not gone away, as the Saudi messages over the last week clearly indicate. And if this chemical weapons agreement falters, although to everyone's surprise, so far it seems to be proceeding, or if the war takes an even darker turn, those demands for American intervention from the region will immediately return, even fiercer, I think, for the intervening delay. Remember the terrible human cost of this war already. Remember that every day, not only does that human cost mount, but the destabilizing impact of this conflict, not only on Syria, but on the whole neighborhood, increases. In an environment of such intense sectarian enmity as exists today in Syria, sadly, where such a large proportion of the population has already been displaced either within the country or outside its borders. It's hard to see, even if the war ended tomorrow, how that displacement effect and the destabilizing impact of those refugee flows on the neighbors would be easily reversed. And at some point, if the war doesn't end, if it escalates and threatens key US allies like Turkey or Jordan or Israel, how will the United States respond? And finally, on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now, I don't think there's any prospect that failure there will demand American military engagement. I don't think there's a demand for that in the region. But I think we can expect that given the dynamics between the parties, even with the very careful lowering of expectations by the United States and everybody else for these talks, if the negotiations break down, if there is no political horizon for a two-state solution, we know what that trajectory looks like. And it is really destabilizing. That would demand a huge amount of American attention, resources, engagement, just to deal with the consequences. So I think the White House would argue, looking at what's happening and how they've responded, that they've been very disciplined, that they've been very restrained in maintaining their intentions, their basic foreign policy approach in the face of tremendous pressure. And they would argue that this is necessary and wise because it allows them to focus their attention in places where they think they can make a real difference. I think that's what you heard in yesterday's New York Times article. But you might have noticed a little quotation in that article from yours truly to the effect that that approach is not enough. Because even while the administration narrows its vision to concentrate on a few chosen issues, the rest of the region continues to undergo this tectonic shift. And while it's probably true that the United States cannot make a decisive difference in the trajectory of Egypt or Tunisia or Libya in the short term, it sure can have an impact in the long term, either by engagement or by neglect. Inaction is also a choice with consequences, and that's something that the Syrian civil war, I think, should have taught us by now. The Egyptian generals might not be paying a lot of attention to American preferences right now, but certainly America faces a choice about whether to try and forge a different kind of partnership with the Egyptian people in the years to come, or whether we simply declare that we don't care and will let the chips fall where they may. I can't tell you that had the United States armed and trained the Syrian rebels a year ago, Assad would have fallen. But to be sure, the decision not to use American money and influence to build a strong central opposition force early in the conflict has made today's diplomatic efforts at conflict resolution almost impossible. And it's also made the war worse for Syrians, as different factions are targeting each other along with the regime. And there's also an argument, counterfactual of course, but not at all illogical, that the weakness and poverty of the major opposition militias left the field wide open for extremist groups to come in and win adherents, and that is exactly what they've done. So the lesson that I take away from the experience of the last couple of years is that sometimes if you're not willing to invest a bit up front, and yes, take a certain amount of risk up front, you can end up paying a lot more down the road. I was at the State Department the other day for a briefing, and I was told that the United States has already spent $1 billion on humanitarian relief for Syrians suffering from the civil war. $1 billion for humanitarian relief. In the 2 years after 3 Arab revolutions and 1 pacted transition, we were not able to get a proposal through Congress for much less than that, $700 million, to support those struggling governments in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen. In fact, when we were dealing with the Arab revolutions, we couldn't even get a regular appropriation through Congress. In April 2011, the government almost shut down. So we managed to get a good deal of support, but we weren't able to do it in a strategic manner, in a planned, long-term, consistent way. So a failure to make those modest investments up front can really cost you down the road. And the unwillingness of the American people to make those investments and the reticence of the U.S. government to make the case for those investments, that troubles me. There's another thing that troubles me right now, and I'll end with this point, and that's the way we as a people are debating and discussing our country's role in the Middle East. Now, I understand and I feel the long shadow that this decade of war has cast over our society. We have learned some very hard lessons about the limits of military power, about the complexity of societies that have experienced decades of autocracy and conflict. It's appropriate, indeed it's necessary, to approach our current challenges with a sense of humility and with a focus on guarding against overreach. And yet I find, whether I'm speaking to members of Congress or to members of the public, that it is almost impossible to talk about the United States doing anything in the Middle East that's not a diplomatic summit without somebody very quickly jumping to the word intervention. It's as though we fear that any kind of intensive American engagement with other countries' politics, whether it's foreign assistance or public diplomacy or partnerships with civil society groups, carries the risk of a slippery slope to military invasion and occupation. Now, as a large country with the world's largest economy, we have global interests, and we have a stake in how other countries do business inside their borders as well as without, because in an interconnected world, that internal-external distinction is just not as meaningful anymore. The rest of the world certainly felt a stake in how we dealt with our government shutdown and our budget controversies. And it's understandable that they feel that stake. We don't call that intervention. We call it global politics. And that's the world we're living in. Now, that reality of an interconnected world imposes a greater burden, I think, on our chief executive when he talks to us about foreign policy. Ultimately, it's not enough to say to the American people, I hear you about wanting to do state building here at home. There's a little bit of foreign stuff we're going to have to do anyway. Just bear with me. The real challenge is to make the case to the American people as to why and how foreign affairs matters to them, how it connects to their lives, to their security, to their aspirations. We need to see more senior officials out there making that case, the way that Secretary Kerry did last week at the Center for American Progress. And we need to do our very best to prevent or mitigate actions by the U.S. government that tend to undermine support for U.S. foreign policy, both at home and with key partners abroad. So President Obama has now committed the rest of his presidency to 3 high-risk diplomatic endeavors in the Middle East. And should they fail, my worry is that the administration might find itself without enough support here at home and without enough of a strong foundation abroad to take the harder steps that it might then need to take to address the crises that result. So I will simply end with this lesson: self-restraint is not enough. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion. Who wants to kick us off? Don't be shy.
I'll start.
Please.
Egypt.
Yes.
One big country to talk about much. Any projections that we're expecting will be in about a year?
Well, look, I think this is a really good example of a place where the White House would argue we can't affect things right now. Look, they've tried. 21 phone calls from Secretary Hagel to General al-Sisi have not produced results. So what are we supposed to do, right? And you can understand where they're coming from. But this is a country of 90 million people. Okay, 1 out of every 5 Arabs is an Egyptian. It's geostrategic. I don't have to tell you that. The importance of the Suez Canal to our east-west transit, to global commerce, the importance of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty for regional stability. All of these things mean we have a huge stake in what happens. Now, there's a short-term answer, which is that these are the guys in power, so they're the ones that are going to keep the Suez open, protect our naval transits, and fight terrorism in the Sinai and keep the peace with Israel. So we got to work with them. And of course that's true. But we've seen the Egyptian people mobilize in unprecedented ways over the last 2 years and do things we would not have predicted. And when you talk to Egyptians today in the wake of the coup, even those who really were very upset with Morsi and were happy to see the military take over, they don't want a military dictatorship. They already overthrew one of those. And they will say, okay, we did it to Mubarak, we did it to Morsi, and if we need to, we'll do it again. So what we have right now in Egypt is not a recipe for stability. We have a very polarized society, a government that is increasingly using repression as its primary means of control, a disastrous macroeconomy. And $12 billion from the Gulf is only going to last some 6 to 9 months. That's how bad it is. That's how big their budget hole is in terms of fuel subsidies and other things. So I think that to get to stability, they are going to have to build some kind of political compact that it's hard for me to see how they get from point A to point B right now, given where they are. It's going to be very painful, and I fear it might be kind of violent. Now, in the interim, the United States does need to get business done day to day with this government, with the guys who are in control. But if we lose sight of the fact that they're only so much in control, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And we have to, there's a degree of bet hedging that the United States needs to be engaged in. But more broadly, I would say whoever the government of Egypt is, they are not going to be able to govern the way Nasser governed. They are going to have to take much greater account of public opinion. And that means that we have a stake in building a coalition in Egyptian society that sees its interest in having decent relations with us. It's kind of analogous, although I wouldn't say perfect analogy, to France after World War II. Incredibly high anti-Americanism in France, right? The threat of France going communist, and a lot of American concern about whether we were going to be able to keep them in the fold. A huge amount of American investment, even setting aside the Marshall Plan, in building that coalition amongst French elites and in French society that favored good ties with the US. I think that's the kind of thing we need to do. Louis.
I just wondered if you'd say a little more about public diplomacy and building civil society, not only that what more could be done, but how it could become more visible so that people do see that there's something else between military intervention and nothing.
Right. You know, sometimes when you talk to U.S. Foreign Service officers who served in the Middle East over the last decade, they would describe that kind of public diplomacy as putting lipstick on a pig. Because, you know, when the primary face of American engagement in the region is the military presence in Iraq, you can do a lot of other great stuff, but it's only going to get you so far, right? Now, I think President Obama felt in 2009 when he made the speech in Cairo that he had an opportunity to shift the balance using things like cooperation on science and technology and education and entrepreneurship. And all of that stuff is important, I think, because when you look at polls or other measures of what this rising generation of Arabs wants for themselves, what is it that they are aspiring to? And what is it that they like about us as opposed to what they don't like about us? Our education system, our freedom, our opportunity, our technology. Fundamentally, what they want for themselves is to be part of this interconnected world, to be part of what my colleague Bob Kagan calls the world America made. It's made by the rules that we helped establish of open societies and open markets. That's what they want for themselves. And so I think to the extent that we can find ways to build on that connection, which isn't always about us, but it is about this world that we're a part of and that we heavily shape, then I think, you know, we can do some good things. For example, I think a US-Tunisian free trade agreement would be a great step. But if you go up to Congress, even though Tunisia is a tiny country and this would have essentially zero impact on the American economy, you can't even talk about a free trade agreement in Congress right now. So this is part of the problem. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is along the lines of what I wanted to ask about. If some of the causes for unrest are these really underlying economic issues, like the lack of diversification of the economy in the Gulf, or like, you know, the generals owning a lot of the economic interests in Egypt, or these kinds of fundamental issues that are preventing job growth and like the youth from being employed. What are some things that are being done and can be done, not by the United States, free trade agreements sound great, but what are being done by the heads of state and these governments to address these underlying issues in the long term?
You know, it's a really good question, and I think that different leaders are dealing with these issues in very different ways. Even within the Gulf, I think you see leaders making different choices. In Qatar, you know, they embarked on a decade-long program of top-to-bottom educational reform, from preschool all the way up, because they knew if they couldn't get the education piece right, nothing else was going to work. That's a long, long, long road. You know, in different Emirates, in Dubai, for example, you've seen much more attention to kind of bringing in sources of innovation. In Abu Dhabi as well, whether they are universities or research institutes or media companies, but trying to insulate to some extent the local society from the effect of these new entrants. So trying to create a marketplace, an innovation marketplace, but that doesn't bleed over into having socio-political effects. That's a very tricky thing to do. So I think that these countries are really struggling to find the answers. This morning I was part of a discussion about Saudi Arabia with a couple of colleagues. And, you know, the Saudis, despite being, you know, very wealthy, oil-rich country, are facing tremendous economic challenges. About 60% of the population are kids, okay, who are expensive for any society because they need education and healthcare and all that stuff. And they have no jobs. Their official male youth unemployment rate is about 25%. So the unofficial rate is probably much higher. And then, of course, there are a lot of educated young women who are not working at all. So massive challenges, and it's not clear whether, given the scale, because Saudi Arabia is, it's over 20 million people, whether even Saudi could afford to make the kind of investments necessary to generate a diversified economy in any near term. It's something that they would have to do over decades. Mirzad.
So, Tamara, you ended up by saying self-restraint is not enough. And you mentioned the 3 gambits that the administration is involved in right now. I'm trying to imagine what possibly can be done to deal with these 3 crises. So when you look back, we have the hyper-interventionism of the Bush era, and the result in Afghanistan and Iraq as one extreme, right? And then this sort of lack of action, more or less, with the Obama administration on the other. On the 3 cases you mentioned, right? When we look at the configuration of forces and what the U.S., what type of asset it has, and what it will take, the liabilities, here is what I see. Let's take the Arab-Israeli case, right? Arm twisting the Israelis to stop the settlements and making some concessions to the Palestinians is going to face, a flood of criticism by Congress and others, right? On the Syrian case, 3 years into the crisis, the recognition seems to be there now, more or less. There's going to be a diplomatic solution to this thing rather than a military solution. And on Iranian nuclear stuff, they have to give in, right? The Iranians are not going to just, sign on the dotted line and not expect anything in return in terms of their enrichment cycle and so forth. Each of these 3 comes with a huge political tag for the Obama administration. So how do you think, in light of the liabilities, are they going to handle these crises?
Well, I think that's a very insightful take, and I would agree that the political space is constrained for the administration on each of these, least on Syria, because of course Congress would be thrilled to not have anything to do with this and never see an AUMF come for a vote again, right? But on Iran and on the peace process, I think you're right. And indeed, they may interact in certain ways that could complicate things further for the administration. I mean, if you take Bibi Netanyahu seriously, it's clear his top priority is Iran and the Iranian nuclear program. And so might he be willing to make certain concessions on the Israeli-Palestinian issue in order to ensure a harder U.S. stance in the negotiations with Iran? And how does the United States deal with that kind of trade-off? So yeah, it could get quite difficult. I would say that, despite the sort of rhetoric that you hear from Congress, I think, number one, that Congress Democrats and Republicans would be very happy to see a deal with Iran that did, that did significant work to lengthen that breakout time and to deal with the nuclear issue in a way that removes the immediate threat and doesn't require military action. I think there would be support in Congress for a good deal. I don't think Congress would, on principle, block a deal. But there are, what a good deal is, there's a spectrum of opinion on that. I actually think from my conversations with Israeli officials that the U.S. and Israel are pretty much on the same page in terms of what an acceptable deal would look like. Even one that acknowledges, the Iranian demand for right to enrich. So I think there's a deal out there that in theory is possible. But the question is, can the Iranians make that deal? And can the U.S. Congress deliver on what would be necessary to sign that deal? Please.
So mine is sort of a follow-up question to Mirzad's, in the sense of trying to drill down a bit more on this self-restraint bit. So the question is, in a way, how much is this sort of posture on the part of the administration of self-restraint not so much taking cues from American public exhaustion, which is certainly there and part of it, but also a kind of foreign policy imagination failure. So how much do we really understand or not understand some of the kind of, you talked about them as complexities, but maybe even more than that, the complexities of the politics of the Arab awakening, or even some of the crises that some of these states are facing. And maybe the Saudi focus here would be worthwhile talking about. I don't know if you saw Valley Nasser's op-ed this morning.
I didn't know.
It's worth reading because it really tries to talk about the kind of political complexities involved in the kind of turn away from the Muslim Brotherhood and a kind of Saudi nominal allyship with historically with the Muslim Brotherhood to its present state now, and what that's really saying about the kind of complexity.
Where Saudi is politically.
The complexities in the region.
Yeah.
Sort of a messy question, I'm sorry.
Well, no, it's an interesting point, and a couple of my friends reading the paper yesterday, and you saw some of this on Twitter too, people looked at the list of officials who were supposedly in the policy review meetings in the White House, and there are no Middle East people in the room. There's also no one from the State Department or Defense Department, as we were discussing last night. So the agencies weren't there to talk about their equities, but there weren't any regional experts. Now, at the end of the day, do you have to be a Middle East expert to get this stuff? Well, let's be honest, a lot of Middle East experts didn't see this stuff coming. So I wouldn't argue that having regional specialists would make all the difference. I don't know if it's failure of imagination. I think a lot of people involved in policy would talk about the tyranny of the inbox, crisis-driven decision-making, and how hard it is to pull your head up out of the weeds and look toward the horizon. And that's always a challenge in policymaking. And that's why we have built into the policy apparatus these units that are meant to do strategic planning. But if you don't rely on them and you're the guy responsible for the day-to-day crises and you suddenly devote yourself to strategic planning, you might have a little trouble lifting your head up out of the weeds. So I think there probably is some of that. But I also think that, given how complex and uncertain political transitions are, even if you're not a Middle East expert, you know that, and given how risk-averse we have become as a nation in foreign policy, and that, I think, in many ways is the best way to encapsulate. It's not necessarily just exhaustion or, or isolationism. We're more risk-averse as a nation. It's hard to figure out where there are opportunities that may or may not pay off that it's worth taking the risk for. I think that is a really hard question. I think it's a necessary question, but I understand why they dodged it.
We have time for one more?
Please.
Actually, I want to clarify something, if you can say, Madam. I am from Iraq, and I noticed I spent 3 months here, but I noticed there is no talking about Iraq.
Yeah.
It's
You're
bad
right.
memory, it's bad things, okay, but about the Syria and Iraqi and the deal that you're talking about, the theory deal, and Israel and United States in the same page, that means this deal, it's include Iraq and Syria. But what about the Saudi? I will not say that the Iraqi will doing the change on themselves, but there is a lot of interference in Iraq.
Yes.
And the Iraq is so critical that will affect many kinds of the regions. It's not easy, because if you're looking for what developed now, there is a military actions in the north of Iraq.
Right.
It's by the Iraqi army. It's against trying to support the Syrian Kurdish people to control the oils area or oil regions in Syria. That means if something happens in Iraq, that will affect everything. Even it will destroy the deal.
Yep.
And if we take account that Iran will have a deal with the United States, and will put Iraq and Syria on the table, that means Turkey and Saudi Arabia will not agree about that. What will happen if they just support, if if you, I know you maybe you have a lot of information about what happened in the 6th governorate in Iraq, and the Sunni people, they're trying to take something, but they didn't.
Right.
Because you call it the key factors in the regions, actually it's Saudi and Emirat, they just give money and to do nothing.
Right.
But just as a card to play with Iran. But what if they say, yeah, do now?
So this is, I think, a really, really important dimension of the regional politics that are at play, and it gets to what I was saying about the divergence between the United States and some of its traditional Gulf partners, because in many ways, I think, you know, Saudi Arabia has always seen Shia-led post-Saddam Iraq as alien, not friendly. Maybe they can learn to live with it, but they're not comfortable, right? And they see a lot of Iranian influence. They see Iraq allowing the Iranian supply flights over their territory to Syria. And so increasingly, there's always been a strong sectarian dimension in Saudi's analysis of the region, but I think increasingly over the last 2 years, that sectarian dimension has come to the fore. And so the Saudis today look around the region and they say they see a sectarian proxy war between themselves and the Iranians. It's in Syria, it's in Iraq, it's in Bahrain, it's in Yemen. They see it everywhere. And they want the United States to come in on the Sunni side of that conflict. The United States, having invested the blood and treasure it's invested in Iraq, and with the analysis that the president laid out in May 2011 that I don't think he's fully rejected about the Arab Spring, the United States does not have an interest in taking one side in a sectarian war all over the Middle East. The United States thinks that Iraq will be stable when it has political bargaining and compromise amongst its various communities. And ultimately, it was the multi-sectarian nature of the Maliki government, with all its flaws, okay, that stabilized Iraq after the last elections. It took a long time. It took a lot of bargaining, but ultimately it was a multi-sectarian government. Now what's
Sisi now, but his name is Maliki.
Yeah. So what happened in Syria and the involvement of these other regional actors in the sectarian conflict in Syria is having impact on Iraqi politics. And we see that. And it's having an impact on sectarian relations in Iraq. And so I think that there is a real gap between what the United States thinks is best to stabilize these countries and what some of its key partners think is best to stabilize these countries. And like I said, you can't paper over it. You got to just talk it out. Sometimes you agree to disagree. Sometimes you come to compromises on what you can do.
Tamara, that was just excellent. Let's thank Tamara.
Thanks very much.